All right, Mark Galeotti joins us now in London. He is a senior associate fellow at RUSI. It's the Royal United Services Institute, and it's a highly respected institute. We often go there as journalists to talk to analysts and experts. And he's also the author of a book which I need to read, which is called We Need to Talk About Putin. Mark, let's talk about Putin.
Indeed.
Alexei Navalny, as we speak, is in a hospital fighting for his life in Germany. Do you think he was poisoned, and by whom?
Well, the first part's the easy bit. Yes, it seems almost certain that he was poisoned, and that's certainly also what we're getting actually out of Germany this morning. By whom? That's the tricky thing. We sometimes tend to think of Russia from a distance as being a totalitarianism where everything comes down from the top and Putin signs off on everything. He's actually, in many ways, a very lazy autocrat. And he's created a system whereby he often doesn't give very, very specific and explicit guidance, but sets broad areas of interest. And umpteen officials, oligarchs, and such like scurry around trying to please the boss. So what we don't know is whether or not this was actually, shall I say, a Kremlin initiated hit, and I suspect not, for reasons we can talk about if you want, or whether rather it was precisely one of these other agencies, someone who had been burned by one of Alexei Navalny's anti-corruption investigations, or feared he was going to be, or some local official who somehow thought that this is exactly what the Kremlin wanted and he would be rewarded for it.
I find it hard to believe, and I think a lot of other people would too, that Alexei Navalny, who is the highest profile opposition figure in Russia, that if somebody was going to poison him, that wouldn't have to be blessed by the Kremlin.
Except that, I mean, we have other examples of form. When Boris Nemtsov, again, one of the very high-profile opposition figures in Russia, was killed, literally a stone's throw from the Kremlin, that does not seem to have been approved by Putin. In fact, it created a sort of quite a stir and a storm in Moscow. But it was actually initiated by Ramzan Kadyrov, the dictator of Chechnya, who incidentally is no fan of Navalny's. There are other figures who genuinely seem to be able to act.
By the way, Boris Nemtsov, for people who don't follow Russia, was the main opposition figure in Russia, extremely liberal. But at one point, he was chosen to be the successor of Boris Yeltsin, and he was a deputy prime minister, and I knew him very well. He ran for mayor in Sochi at one point to try and get a political foothold again, fighting for independence, and he was also a supporter of Ukraine. So certainly he was thought to be a foe of the Kremlin.
Exactly. So I think that it's often that people feel, they assume that this is what Putin would want. And in a way, the issue becomes not whether or not the Kremlin is innocent, but it's differently guilty. There are those hits which clearly the Kremlin initiated, and there are those hits which happened because the Kremlin has created a country and a system in which actually a whole variety of different agencies do use violence, up to and including murder, and can get away with it, and the state will still have their back.
I want to read a paragraph from the editorial that you wrote for the Moscow Times, because I think it's very well written, and you're a great writer, and it's very clear, but you can just tell me what you meant by it. A state that kills is a terrible thing, but its red lines can generally be observed and it can ultimately be held to account. But a state that permits a whole range of actors and interests to kill with impunity is an even more uncomfortable thing, as the red lines may be invisible, intersecting, and mobile, and the challenge of accountability is even greater. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is precisely that the real challenge for people in Russia who are trying to still use whatever space there is for opposition politics, for civil society, for bringing this elite, this thoroughly corrupt, self-interested elite to account, they may think they know what is acceptable, and it may well be that it is acceptable today. But the point is, because there are so many other individuals who, in a way, draw their own red lines, you never really know when you're stepping over that. Let me give one example. I mean, I work on Russian gangsters and also the Russian intelligence service. And as a result, I've sat down with some deeply unpleasant people from time to time. One of the few people I have absolutely been warned off looking at carefully is a man by the name of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's sometimes known as Putin's chef, though he wasn't Putin's chef, but who is a businessman who is behind, for example, the Wagner Mercenary Corporation that we've seen in Donbass, Syria, Libya, and elsewhere. And but basically, as well as, he also incidentally ran the troll factory of infame from the last presidential elections in the States.
These are the troll factories that put out information and disinformation and were largely responsible for interfering in the American election of 2016.
Exactly. Now, this is a guy who's basically, I mean, it's worth mentioning, a guy with a criminal record, who has done well precisely by doing whatever business the Kremlin needs doing. So basically, whatever it is, whether it's trolls or mercenaries or indeed setting up the kitchens to feed the army, he will do it. In return for that, though, he seems to have been given massive degrees of autonomy. I mean, he's been linked with the murder of Russian journalists who are looking into the activities of Wagner Group in Africa. He's been linked with all kinds of activities. And he's not unique in this. There are these figures within Russia who basically have set themselves up as almost we could think of as warlords. If this was a medieval country, we'd have no trouble thinking them as warlords. Because they wear suits and everything else, we have trouble using the same vocabulary. But frankly, that's what they are. And this is the problem in Russia. There is a vicious and sometimes murderous state, but one which is actually in some ways relatively restrained. But then there are other figures who are unrestrained and even more vicious.
It's interesting that when Salisbury occurred, the poisoning of an ex-Russian GRU, a spy in Salisbury, that somebody asked me on air, is it disturbing that Putin would approve this? And I said, yes, but it's probably even more disturbing if he didn't, because that would tell you that the security services now were operating off the leash. Do you think that that is occurring? Does Putin have control of the security services, the FSB, the GRU, and others that are operating that may have carried out the poisoning of Navalny if in fact he was poisoned?
I think the answer is that Putin has the level of control that he wants to have. In other words, I think he absolutely chooses to step back from something. I mean, if we take the Salisbury poisoning, I do believe he would have signed off on it. I think anything that has a major international implication like that, such as a murder in the UK, I think that would have to cross his desk, even though it probably would be initiated by the other people, but they would just have to get the bosses okay. Something like this, domestically, a Russian citizen in Russia, I think the honest answer is it could have crossed Putin's desk, but it doesn't necessarily need to have done so. I think he's willing to allow these people a lot of autonomy. And then if they mess up badly, he will punish them. If they succeed, he will reward them. But the whole nature of the Putin's regime is that he wants these people desperately competing for his favor. I mean, that is the true currency of Russia. It's not the ruble, it's not the dollar, it's Putin's favor. If you have that, you can do anything.
Why do you think now? I mean, why would they go after Navalny now? Is it because of what's happening in Belarus and they fear that he is igniting potentially the same kind of fire?
Well, I'll give you two answers. One of them is it could be something that's very local and very conditional. I mean, we know that he was in Tomsk in Siberia, not just meeting local activists, but also engaging in one of his exceedingly forensic anti-corruption investigations. So it might be that literally it was a local person, someone there who didn't want their grimy deals being exposed and therefore felt he had to do something about it. So that's a possibility. But the other one is, yes, you mentioned Belarus. We have this explosion of people power in Belarus. At the same time, there is a mood of dissatisfaction within Russia. We see it in Khabarovsk on the Chinese border, where for weeks now they've been protesting the arrest of their elected governor, not because they like him particularly, but because it's an example of Moscow just simply reaching in because he doesn't like the candidate. And anyway, the thing about Khabarovsk is it's not that unique or unusual a city. If it can happen in Khabarovsk, it can happen anywhere. We have local elections that are coming up in September. And Navalny in particular was championing this notion of what he called smart vote, which is essentially that people should be encouraged to vote for whichever candidate, whatever party they come from, who is most likely to displace the government's United Russia bloc. So it could be that in that situation, Navalny, who after all has generally been very, very good at knowing just how to stay on the right side of the red line, didn't notice that that line had shifted and that a new mood of concern has arisen, and they decided no. Navalny is just too charismatic, too popular, and his smart vote system is too potentially dangerous for us to continue to allow him to operate.
Do you think Navalny has been removed? I mean, let's say he recovers. You know, the question is, does a lot of these people never go back to Russia? And I would think that Alexei Navalny will try to go back because that's his raison d'etre. I mean, he wants to campaign against the Kremlin, and he has been fearless in doing so. And if he goes back, is he more empowered? Have they just created a kind of political opposition martyr of sorts?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, Navalny himself, when he's asked, how come he's still alive, his answer is precisely, well, actually, the Kremlin realizes that I'd be more dangerous to them dead than alive. Now, we'll see. I mean, obviously, depends quite how he recovers and what his mood is, but he has indeed shown himself to be indomitable in the past. I mean, he's been arrested 13 times. His brother has been sent to prison to bring pressure to bear on him. He was almost blinded when they splashed antiseptic dye on his face. And this is his second time he's been poisoned. If he returns, I think, it does give him that additional status, and particularly, actually, and it's slightly fanciful, but if one looks at kind of Russian cultural mythology, there is something about the figure who is prepared to literally put his life and everything on the line. That becomes a very sort of powerful element. We see it in Russian folklore, in Russian history, and today. Now, I think the key other element of this is, so far, Navalny's anti-corruption and sort of anti-government movement has been very Navalny-focused, understandably. This might actually create the opportunity for a new rising generation of activists to really come into their own. And I think that's crucial, because the thing that Navalny has always lacked, not been able to properly do, is institutionalize his movement. Turn it from just simply being one guy with allies and supporters and a YouTube feed into a true national movement. This might help push things right over that edge point.
It may have backfired on whoever thought they would carry this out with the approval of the Kremlin.
Absolutely. I mean, to be blunt, I think the lesson that we've seen from truly successful, awful authoritarian regimes is, if you're going to do it properly. Don't take half measures. And I think the notion that Navalny would be intimidated by this is, of course, wrong. The notion that his supporters are likely to be intimidated by this is likely to prove wrong. I do think that in this respect, it was a mistake.
Hey, Mark Galeotti, thank you so much, from the Royal United Services Institute, and the book that I'm going to read, and I know you will too. We need to talk about Putin.
My pleasure. Thank you.